Deep in the lands south of Egypt, beyond the first cataract of the Nile, there once rose a kingdom that most of the world has forgotten, the kingdom of Kush. While Egypt built its pyramids and carved its name into the sands of time, Kush quietly thrived in the shadows. Its people were powerful, proud, and deeply connected to the Nile, the same river that had sustained Egypt for thousands of years. But Kush wasn't just a passive neighbor. They built cities, temples, and massive pyramids of their own, smaller but steeper than those of Egypt. Their capital, Napata, became a shining center of religion and culture, where the great god Ammonius was worshipped just as fervently as he was in Thebes. You see, Egypt and Kush weren't enemies at first. They were connected through trade, religion, and even blood. For centuries, goods and ideas flowed up and down the Nile. Gold, ivory, and exotic animals from Kush enriched Egyptian markets. Egyptian priests and artisans influenced Kushite temples and art. But when Egypt began to weaken, after the power of the new kingdom faded, the Kushites watched carefully. Egypt, once a mighty empire, had become divided, ruled by feuding local kings and invaded by foreign powers. And in that chaos, Kush saw opportunity. No longer content to remain in Egypt's shadow, the Kushites began to see themselves as the true heirs of Egypt's legacy, the rightful restorers of the land of the Pharaohs. It was no longer a question of if they would act. It was a question of when. Egypt in chaos. The perfect moment to strike. By the 8th century BC, Egypt was a shadow of its former self. The great days of Ramses the Great were long gone. The once mighty pharaohs had given way to squabbling local rulers, men who called themselves kings but controlled only fragments of what was once the world's richest land. Egypt was divided between the north and the south. In the north, powerful local dynasties in cities like Tanis and Sais struggled for dominance. In the south, near Thebes, priests of Ammonius had become so influential that they often rivaled the pharaohs themselves. Foreign powers, especially from Asia and the Levant, watched Egypt's disunity with hungry eyes. Assyria was expanding rapidly to the northeast, and smaller kingdoms like Israel and Phoenicia were being drawn into its orbit. Amid all this turmoil, the Kushites stood strong. Their kingdom to the south was stable, rich in resources, and united under powerful kings who commanded both respect and fear. Then came a ruler named Piye, also known as Pianki, a man destined to change everything. Piye was not just a warrior, he was a believer. To him, Egypt's decline wasn't just a political failure, it was a spiritual one. He saw Egypt as a sacred land that had lost its connection to the gods. And as a devout follower of Ammonius, Piye believed it was his divine mission to restore order, Ma'at, as the Egyptians called it. But make no mistake, this wasn't just about faith. Piye also saw a rare chance to expand his power. Egypt's weakness had created a vacuum, and Piye was ready to fill it. In 728 BC, he launched his legendary campaign northward, sailing up the Nile with his army and sacred banners of Ammonius. City after city fell to his forces, not just by blood, but by the belief that Piye was chosen by the gods themselves to unite the two lands once more. This wasn't a mere invasion. It was a reclamation, a southern kingdom rising to claim the throne of Egypt itself. Piye's conquest of Egypt, how Kush took the throne. The year was around 728 BC, and the Nile's waters carried something far greater than trade or travelers. They carried an army. At its head stood King Piye of Kush, a ruler whose ambition stretched beyond Nubia's borders and into the heart of Egypt itself. He had one goal: to reunite the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, under divine order once again. But unlike many conquerors who sought gold or glory, Piye framed his campaign as a holy mission. To him, this wasn't invasion, it was restoration. As Piye's fleet advanced northward, city after city fell, not always through battle, but through submission. Many Egyptian rulers saw the writing on the wall. Their fragmented armies and weak alliances were no match for the disciplined and motivated Kushite forces. Piye was shrewd. He didn't simply destroy. He demanded loyalty and religious devotion. He required local rulers to purify themselves, make offerings to Ammonius, and pledge allegiance to him as the chosen of the gods. This gave his campaign a spiritual legitimacy that no Egyptian warlord could match. One of the key moments came at Hermopolis, where Piye's forces defeated a coalition of northern princes led by Tefnakht, the ruler of Sais. Tefnakht had united several Egyptian city-states in a desperate bid to repel the Kushites. But Piye's strategy was relentless, advancing slowly, methodically, cutting off cities one by one until the coalition collapsed. Finally, Piye surrounded Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt. According to inscriptions found on Piye's own victory stela, one of the most detailed ancient military records we possess, he took Memphis through brilliant tactics and sheer determination. He refused to destroy the city. Instead, he entered as a savior king, purifying temples, honoring Egypt's gods, and reinstating order. His inscriptions proudly declare, "No one can oppose him, the son of Ammonius, beloved of the gods." It was both a political and psychological triumph. The Egyptians, weary of division and chaos, accepted him not as a foreign invader, but as a legitimate pharaoh. And so, for the first time in history, a Kushite king ruled Egypt. The dream of uniting the two lands was realized, not from the north, but from the south. Piye returned to Napata soon after, content with his divine victory. He didn't destroy Egypt or occupy it with force. Instead, he left behind loyal governors and a dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly a century. This was the dawn of the 25th dynasty, the age of the Black Pharaohs. The reign of the Black Pharaohs, restoring Egypt's glory. The Kushite rule over Egypt was unlike any foreign dynasty before it. Instead of exploiting Egypt's wealth or destroying its traditions, the Black Pharaohs sought to revive them. Under Piye's successors, Shabaka, Shabitu, and Taharqa, Egypt experienced a remarkable cultural renaissance. These kings saw themselves not as conquerors, but as protectors of Egypt's sacred legacy. They restored ancient temples, rebuilt monuments, and revived the fading worship of Ammonius, the chief god of Thebes. The great temple complex at Karnak flourished again, adorned with inscriptions and statues bearing the proud features of Kushite rulers. And for the first time in centuries, the idea of a united Egypt became real again, from the Delta to the Sudanese plains. But the Kushite pharaohs didn't just copy Egyptian traditions, they blended them with their own. They brought the strength and spirit of Nubia into the heart of Egypt's culture. You can see it in their art, their pyramids, and their royal rituals, Egyptian in form, but Nubian in soul. Among them, one name stands above all, Taharqa. Under Taharqa's reign, Egypt reached its last great age of glory before the foreign invasions. He ruled an empire stretching from the Mediterranean deep into the African interior. He launched massive building projects, from temples in Nubia to colossal statues in Thebes. Even the Bible mentions Taharqa as the mighty Ethiopian king who stood against Assyria. But greatness always draws envy and danger. To the east, a storm was rising, the Assyrian Empire. Ruthless, expansionist, and militarily unstoppable, they looked toward Egypt with the same hunger that Piye once had. And soon, the Black Pharaohs would face the greatest test of their reign, a war that would decide the fate of Egypt forever. The Assyrian invasion, when empires collided. By the early 7th century BC, the Kushite rulers of Egypt had achieved what few thought possible. They had revived Egypt's lost power. Under Pharaoh Taharqa, the empire stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the upper reaches of the Nile, commanding respect across Africa and the Near East. But in the east, another empire was rising, and it was ruthless. The Assyrians. Led by kings like Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, the Assyrians had forged the most powerful army the world had ever seen. Iron weapons, siege engines, and brutal tactics that crushed every kingdom in their path. They had already subdued Babylon, conquered parts of Phoenicia, and now their eyes turned toward Egypt, the last great prize. To them, the Kushite pharaohs were outsiders, Africans ruling what the Assyrians considered their sphere of influence. And to the Assyrian kings, no outsider would be allowed to control the trade routes and riches of the Nile. Taharqa, brave and proud, prepared for war. He fortified Egypt's northern cities, gathered his armies, and relied on the loyalty of his Egyptian subjects. But the Assyrians were unlike any foe he had faced. In 671 BC, Esarhaddon led a massive campaign into Egypt. The Assyrian army marched through the Sinai, defeating Egyptian garrisons one by one. Their discipline and sheer numbers overwhelmed even the fierce Kushite soldiers. Taharqa himself fought valiantly, but the Assyrians pushed deep into Lower Egypt, capturing Memphis, the ancient capital. Taharqa was forced to retreat south, regrouping near Thebes. But Egypt would not submit easily. After Esarhaddon's death, Taharqa returned and briefly reclaimed parts of the Nile Delta, proving that the spirit of Kushite resistance was not yet broken. Then came Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria. Determined to end Kushite rule once and for all, he launched another invasion in 667 BC. This time, the Assyrian assault was merciless. They captured Thebes, looted its temples, and left the once glorious city in ruins. The Black Pharaohs had fought bravely, but even their might couldn't stand against the world's most advanced war machine. And so, the Assyrians conquered Egypt, ending the Kushite dynasty's direct control over the north. But the Kushites themselves were not destroyed. They simply withdrew, retreating deep into their homeland along the southern Nile. From there, they would build anew. The legacy of Kush, the pharaohs who refused to vanish. Though the Assyrians claimed victory, the Kushite spirit did not die. Far from it, it simply went home. After withdrawing from Egypt, the Kushite kings established their new capital at Meroe, farther south along the Nile. There, among the red sands and acacia trees, they built a kingdom that would endure for nearly 1,000 more years. And even as Egypt fell under Assyrian, then Persian, and later Greek control, the people of Kush kept their traditions alive. They continued to worship Ammonius, build pyramids, and honor their ancestors who once ruled the land of the pharaohs. In fact, Meroe became known as the City of 1,000 Pyramids. Its rulers continued to call themselves kings and queens of Upper and Lower Egypt, holding on to titles that once shook the world. The Kushites proved that empire was not just about land, it was about identity and legacy. Their influence spread across Africa, inspiring later Nubian kingdoms and even echoing into modern Sudanese heritage. Their art, architecture, and royal symbols showed a powerful fusion, African heart with Egyptian soul. And centuries later, when archaeologists unearthed the pyramids of Nubia, they realized something astonishing. These rulers were not imitators of Egypt, they were heirs to it. The Kushite dynasty, the so-called Black Pharaohs, had done what no other foreign power ever achieved. They conquered Egypt, ruled it with dignity, and left it stronger, not weaker. Their story is one of resilience, pride, and defiance, a reminder that Africa was never merely a bystander to history, but one of its greatest authors. And though the sands have buried their cities, the legacy of Kush still whispers along the Nile, telling the world that empires may fall, but greatness endures. The rediscovery of Kush, unearthing a lost African empire. For centuries after their fall, the kingdom of Kush was nearly forgotten. The sands of the Sudanese desert swallowed its temples, its pyramids, and its history. To most of the ancient world, and even to later Egyptians, Kush became a name whispered in myths, its glory lost to time. But in the 19th century, everything changed. European explorers and archaeologists traveling through Nubia began to uncover strange pyramids, dozens upon dozens of them, not in Egypt, but deep in Sudan. Smaller, steeper, and clustered together, they were unlike anything seen before. When scholars studied the inscriptions, they were stunned. These weren't Egyptian tombs. They belonged to a completely different line of pharaohs, kings and queens who ruled from Napata and Meroe, calling themselves lords of the two lands, just as Ramses and Thutmose had. It was then that history rediscovered the Kushite Empire, the African dynasty that once sat upon Egypt's throne. Archaeologists found temples dedicated to Ammonius, royal statues carved in the distinctly Kushite style, powerful features, broad shoulders, and the unmistakable crown of the double Egypts. They found inscriptions naming Piye, Shabaka, and Taharqa, the very pharaohs once dismissed as myths. And perhaps most remarkable of all, they found evidence of strong queens, known as the Kandakes. warrior queens who ruled in their own right long after Egypt's decline. Some of them even led armies against the Romans centuries later. Bit by bit, the story of Kush came alive again. What had once been dismissed as a footnote in Egyptian history was revealed to be a great African civilization, one that rivaled Egypt in strength, wealth, and faith. The rediscovery of Kush didn't just rewrite history, it redefined it. It reminded the world that Africa's heart had been a center of empire, innovation, and divine kingship long before others had even dreamed of civilization. Legacy and reflection, the empire that time could not erase. Today, the story of the Kushite invasion of Egypt stands as one of the most remarkable tales in ancient history. It's a story of a forgotten kingdom rising from the shadows, claiming its place among the giants, and for a time, ruling the very cradle of civilization. The Kushites didn't just conquer Egypt with spears and chariots. They conquered it with belief in their gods, in their destiny, and in the unbreakable unity between the Nile's northern and southern lands. Their reign as the 25th dynasty may have lasted less than a century, but their influence lasted far longer. They reminded Egypt of its ancient values, restored its temples, and rekindled its spiritual flame. And though Assyria eventually pushed them back, the Kushites never vanished. Their descendants thrived for hundreds of years, ruling from Meroe and shaping African history long after Egypt's light had faded. Even today, their pyramids still stand, hundreds of them, silent but proud, a testament to a people who refuse to be forgotten. When we look at the story of Kush, we see more than conquest. We see resilience, identity, and legacy. A southern kingdom that rose against the odds. A forgotten people who once wore the crowns of pharaohs. And an empire that time itself could not erase. Because in the end, history doesn't just belong to the victors, it belongs to those who endure. And the kingdom of Kush endures still, in the sands of Nubia, in the memory of Africa, and in the rediscovered pages of the human story. The power of the Kandaks, warrior queens of Kush. Long after the fall of their rule in Egypt, the kingdom of Kush continued to thrive, and in this later era, something extraordinary happened. The throne of Kush was no longer ruled only by kings, but by queens. They were known as the Kandaks, or Candaces, a title meaning queen mother, or ruler in her own right. These women weren't figureheads. They were warriors, diplomats, and builders. Some led armies into battle, others negotiated with foreign powers. Together, they proved that Kush's strength wasn't just born of its past, it lived on through the courage of its women. One of the most famous Kandaks was Amanirenas, who ruled in the 1st century BC. When the mighty Roman Empire invaded Nubia after conquering Egypt, most kingdoms would have bowed in fear. But not Kush, and certainly not Amanirenas. She led her own soldiers into battle against Rome, personally commanding her forces. In one legendary campaign, her army marched north and captured the Roman garrison at Syene, modern Aswan. They even brought back the bronze head of Emperor Augustus, burying it beneath the steps of a Kushite temple so that people would literally walk over the emperor's image, a symbolic act of defiance that still stuns historians today. Though the Romans eventually pushed back, they never truly conquered Kush. Instead, a peace treaty was signed, on equal terms, between Amanirenas and Emperor Augustus himself. It was one of the few times in Roman history that the empire negotiated peace with another power instead of forcing submission. Under the Kandaks, Kush flourished, its pyramids multiplied, its trade expanded, and its art reached new heights. They showed the world that leadership wasn't bound by gender, and that courage, wisdom, and dignity could define a kingdom as much as conquest ever could. The reign of the Kandaks marked the final golden age of Kush, an era where queens ruled with strength and grace, defending the legacy of their ancestors and proving that the spirit of the Black Pharaohs still burned brightly. The fall and eternal legacy of Kush. But even the greatest kingdoms must one day face the weight of time. By the 4th century CE, the power of Kush began to fade. Trade routes shifted, desertification crept closer, and new rising powers, especially the kingdom of Aksum from the Ethiopian highlands, began to dominate the region. Aksum's armies eventually marched north, defeating Meroe and bringing an end to the Kushite kingdom around 350 CE. After more than 1,000 years of rule, the civilization of Kush finally fell silent. Yet, though their cities crumbled and their temples sank beneath the sands, their legacy could not be erased. The Kushites had done what no other African kingdom had achieved. They had conquered Egypt, ruled as pharaohs, stood against Assyria and Rome, and built one of the longest-lasting civilizations in ancient history. Their story reminds us that Africa was not a silent spectator to the world's great empires. It was one of them. The echoes of Kush still live on, in the pyramids of Meroe, in the traditions of Nubian culture, and in the hearts of historians who continue to uncover their story. Every stone, every inscription, every buried crown whispers the same truth. That greatness is not defined by how long an empire lasts, but by how deeply it leaves its mark on time. And the kingdom of Kush, the empire that rose from the heart of Africa to rule the land of the Pharaohs, left a mark that endures forever. Because even when forgotten by the world, the Nile remembers. And the Nile never forgets its kings or its queens.